Route 47 cuts through Millbrook like a scar, and every morning at 8:15 a.m., the Hells Angels roar past Eddie's diner on their way to nowhere important. And every morning, a mangy German shepherd throws himself against the chain-link fence behind the diner, barking with desperate fury at the leather-clad riders. For 3 months, Tank Morrison had heard the dog's frantic cries echoing off the asphalt. Tank wasn't the sentimental type. 20 years in the club had beaten that out of him. But today, something in the dog's eyes made him pull over. Behind the fence, he found more than just an abandoned animal. Hidden beneath a pile of rotting lumber was a faded military jacket, dog tags, and a photograph that made Tank's blood run cold. The old man who'd been feeding this dog wasn't just some vagrant. He was the war hero who'd supposedly died when Tank was 8 years old, the same father who'd abandoned him to a system that had nearly destroyed him. Now Tank had to decide, was this dog trying to lead him to redemption, or was he walking straight into the trap his father had set 25 years ago? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Tank's massive hands trembled as he held the photograph. The image was water-stained and cracked, but there was no mistaking the face staring back at him. Same steel-grey eyes, same stubborn jawline he saw in the mirror every morning. The man in the picture wore dress blues, his chest decorated with ribbons Tank couldn't identify. In his arms, a gap-toothed 8-year-old boy grinned at the camera, clutching a toy motorcycle. The German shepherd had stopped barking. It pressed its nose through the chain link, whimpering softly as if sensing Tank's shock. The dog's ribs showed through matted fur, and its eyes held an intelligence that made Tank uncomfortable. Those eyes had been trying to tell him something for months. "Where is he?" Tank's voice came out rough, barely above a whisper. The dog backed away from the fence, then trotted toward a cluster of abandoned shipping containers at the far end of the lot. It looked back once, waiting. Tank's Harley idled behind him, and he could hear the distant rumble of his brother's bikes fading down Route 47. He should follow them. Whatever this was, whatever game his old man was playing from beyond the grave, it wasn't his problem. The club was his family now. Had been since he was 16, and Razor found him bleeding in an alley after another foster home went wrong. But his feet were already moving toward the gap in the fence. The shipping containers formed a makeshift maze, their rusted walls tagged with graffiti and bullet holes. The German shepherd led him deeper into the maze, past overturned shopping carts and piles of garbage. The stench of decay mixed with something else, coffee grounds and cigarettes, the smell of someone living rough. They stopped in front of the largest container. Its doors hung open, revealing a space that had been converted into a crude shelter. A sleeping bag, a camp stove, dozens of empty cans stacked in neat pyramids. Books everywhere, military, histories, philosophy, poetry. On the wall, newspaper clippings about the Hells Angels were thumbtacked in careful rows. Tank's stomach clenched. His father had been watching him, tracking his life, his arrest record, his rise through the club's ranks. 37 years old, a voice said behind him. Still riding that damn motorcycle. Tank spun around. The man leaning against the container entrance barely resembled the soldier in the photograph. Grey beard, weathered skin, clothes that had seen too many winters, but the eyes were the same. "Hello, son." Tank's hand moved instinctively to the knife on his belt. "You're supposed to be dead." "I was, for a while." His father stepped into the container, moving with a slight limp. Military funeral, closed casket, the whole show. Amazing what you can arrange when the right people owe you favors. "Why?" The word came out like a growl. "'Cause I was dying anyway. Cancer. Had maybe 6 months." The old man sat heavily on a milk crate. "Your mother was already gone. Foster system seemed better than watching Daddy waste away. The cancer? Went into remission, stayed that way for 20 years. His father's laugh was bitter. Funny how these things work out. Tank wanted to hit him, wanted to wrap his hands around that weathered throat and squeeze until all the years of pain and abandonment came pouring out. Instead, he found himself looking at the dog, who had curled up on the sleeping bag like it belonged there. "Duke's been my only company for 3 years," his father said, following Tank's gaze. "Found him hit by a truck on Route 47. Been trying to get your attention ever since you boys started your morning rides. What do you want?" "To explain, before it's too late again." His father reached into his jacket and pulled out a manila envelope. "The cancer's back, Tank. Real this time. I've got maybe a month." Tank stared at the envelope like it might explode. Whatever was inside would change everything, and he'd built a good life on the ashes of his old one. The club expected loyalty above all else. Family came second. But looking at Duke, at this broken old soldier who'd shaped his life through absence, Tank realized some choices couldn't be avoided. He reached for the envelope. The barking started again at exactly 7:23 a.m., just like it had every morning for the past 3 months. Tank Rodriguez rolled over in his narrow bunk, squinting at the digital clock through bloodshot eyes. The sound cut through the morning air like a rusty blade, echoing off the concrete walls of the clubhouse and rattling the grimy windows. "Jesus Christ," muttered Crow from the bunk across the room. "Someone needs to deal with that damn mutt before I put a bullet in it." Tank sat up slowly, his massive frame creaking the metal bed frame. At 42, 20 years with the Devil's Disciples had left its mark on his body. Knife scars crisscrossed his forearms, and his left shoulder ached whenever it rained. But it was the look in his dark eyes that made most people step aside when he walked down the street. Today, though, those eyes held something different. Curiosity. He pulled on yesterday's jeans and a black t-shirt, the familiar ritual of dressing interrupted by another round of frantic barking. Through the cracked window, he could see nothing but the empty lot next to Mickey's auto shop, where rusted car parts created a metallic graveyard under the pale morning sun. The clubhouse kitchen reeked of stale beer and cigarettes. Tank poured himself coffee from a pot that looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Clinton administration, then stepped outside onto the cracked asphalt. The Arizona heat was already building, promising another scorching day in Phoenix. The barking was closer now, more desperate. Tank lit a Marlboro and tried to pinpoint the source. It seemed to be coming from behind the auto shop, somewhere in that maze of broken-down vehicles and rusted machinery. He'd walked past that lot 1,000 times in the past year, but he'd never really looked at it. Not really. "You gonna stand there all morning listening to that racket?" Tank turned to see Viper walking toward him, leather vest already on despite the early hour. Vincent Viper Castellano was the club's vice president, a wiry man with dead eyes and a reputation for solving problems permanently. He'd been riding with the Disciples since before Tank was even a prospect. "Just thinking," Tank replied, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "Thinking's dangerous in our line of work," Viper said, not entirely joking. "We got that shipment coming in tonight. You ready?" Tank nodded, but his attention drifted as the barking started up again. This time it sounded different, not aggressive or territorial, but almost pleading, like a cry for help. "You hear that?" Tank asked. Viper listened for a moment, then shrugged. "Probably some stray looking for scraps. They always hang around auto shops looking for antifreeze to drink. Sweet poison." He laughed at his own dark humor. "Speaking of which, Dutch wants to see you in an hour. Something about the Henderson job." After Viper disappeared back into the clubhouse, Tank found himself walking toward the chain-link fence that separated their property from Mickey's lot. The fence was topped with razor wire, and several no trespassing signs hung at irregular intervals, but there was a gap near the back corner where someone had cut through the links years ago. The barking had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that felt heavier than the Arizona heat. Tank finished his cigarette and flicked the butt into the dirt. He had an hour before Dutch wanted to see him, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt drawn to investigate the source of the daily disturbance. He squeezed through the gap in the fence, his leather vest catching briefly on the twisted metal. The auto shop lot was larger than it appeared from the street, filled with cars in various states of decay. Some looked like they'd been there for decades, Their paint faded to prima and their tires flat and cracked. Tank moved carefully between the vehicles, his boots crunching on broken glass and scattered bolts. The silence was unsettling after months of morning barking. He was beginning to think the dog had moved on when he heard something else, a soft whimpering coming from behind an overturned Buick. He rounded the corner of the massive car and stopped dead in his tracks. A small German Shepherd mix sat next to a makeshift shelter built from a shopping cart and old tarps. The dog's ribs showed through its dirty coat, and its eyes held a wariness that Tank recognized from his own mirror. But it wasn't the dog that made Tank's blood run cold. It was what the dog was guarding. A small pile of belongings sat carefully arranged under the tarp: a child's backpack, a stuffed rabbit missing one ear, and a pair of tiny sneakers that couldn't have belonged to anyone older than 7 or 8. The dog watched Tank with intelligent brown eyes, no longer barking but ready to defend its post. Tank's hands began to shake as the implications hit him like a freight train. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the cracked asphalt as Jake crouched beside his Harley, wrench in hand. The familiar sound of barking echoed from behind the chain-link fence separating the clubhouse from the abandoned lot next door. 3 o'clock, like clockwork. "Goddamn mutt," muttered Tank from his perch on the front steps, not even looking up from his beer. "Been going on for what, 2 months now?" Jake paused mid-turn on the bolt he'd been tightening. 2 months. That's exactly when it started. Right after the Ramirez job, when things got messy and the club had to lie low for a while. He'd assumed it was just another stray looking for scraps, but strays didn't keep schedules. The barking intensified, taking on an almost frantic quality. Jake found himself standing, wiping his hands on his jeans as he walked toward the fence. The lot beyond was a wasteland of rusted car parts, broken concrete, and weeds that grew through everything, like nature was trying to reclaim what man had abandoned. "Where you going?" Tank called out. "Just checking something." The fence was about 7 feet high, topped with rusted barbed wire that hadn't been maintained in years. Jake grabbed the chain links and peered through. At first he saw nothing but debris and shadows. Then movement caught his eye near a collapsed concrete wall about 50 yards in. A medium-sized dog, maybe a German Shepherd mix, was pacing frantically near what looked like a makeshift shelter constructed from a sheet of corrugated metal and some wooden pallets. The animal's coat was matted and dirty, ribs visible even from this distance, but it wasn't just hungry barking. There was something desperate about it, purposeful. Jake studied the scene more carefully. The shelter wasn't random debris blown together by wind. Someone had built it, positioned it strategically against the concrete wall for maximum protection, and the dog wasn't just wandering around aimlessly. It was guarding something. "Jesus," he whispered. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't about the dog at all. The animal was trying to get their attention, trying to get help for someone or something in that shelter. Jake glanced back at Tank, who was now engrossed in conversation with Razor about some bar fight from the weekend. Nobody was paying attention to him. He followed the fence line until he found a section where the bottom had pulled away from its concrete anchor, creating a gap just wide enough for a man to squeeze through if he didn't mind getting dirty. The dog spotted him immediately as he emerged on the other side. Instead of running or becoming aggressive, it actually seemed to calm down slightly, as if relieved that someone had finally responded to its calls. It backed toward the shelter, never taking its eyes off Jake, making soft whining sounds that were somehow more unsettling than the barking had been. Jake approached slowly, hands visible and non-threatening. The smell hit him when he was still 20 feet away. Not death, thankfully, but unwashed human and sickness and something else he couldn't identify. The dog reached the shelter and sat down directly in front of the opening, tail wagging tentatively but still alert, still protective. "Easy, boy," Jake said softly. "I'm not going to hurt anyone." He knelt down near the entrance to the shelter and carefully moved aside a torn piece of fabric that served as a door. What he saw inside made his chest tighten. A kid, maybe 10 or 11 years old, was curled up on a pile of old blankets and newspapers. The child was unconscious or sleeping, breathing shallow and rapid. dark hair plastered to a fevered forehead, clothes that might have once been blue jeans and a yellow t-shirt but were now mostly dirt and stains. On the ground nearby, an empty can that had once contained soup and a plastic water bottle with maybe an inch of muddy liquid sloshing in the bottom. He looked at the animal, who was watching him intently. "You've been taking care of him, haven't you?" The dog's tail wagged once, as if it understood. Jake pulled out his phone, then stopped. Calling 911 would bring questions, investigations, attention the club couldn't afford right now. But looking at the kid's pale face and feeling the fever radiating from that small body, he knew there wasn't really a choice to make. He was about to dial when he heard voices carrying across the lot from the clubhouse. Tank was calling his name, probably wondering where he'd disappeared to. In a few minutes, someone would come looking. The kid stirred slightly, mumbling something incoherent. The dog immediately moved closer, gently licking the child's hand in a gesture so tender it made Jake's throat close up. Whatever was about to happen, there was no going back now. The rain had stopped by the time Tank reached the abandoned warehouse district, but the air still hung heavy with moisture and the smell of rust. He'd been walking for 20 minutes, following the narrow alley that ran behind Murphy's diner, the same path he'd seen the old mutt take countless times. His boots splashed through puddles that reflected the dim glow of a single streetlight, its bulb flickering like a dying heartbeat. The dog had vanished somewhere in this maze of crumbling brick and broken dreams. Tank paused at the mouth of another alley, listening. Nothing but the distant hum of traffic and the occasional drip of water from fire escapes overhead. He was beginning to think this whole thing was a waste of time when he heard it, a soft whimpering coming from deeper in the shadows. Tank pulled out his phone and activated the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing overflowing dumpsters, scattered newspapers, and the skeletal remains of old shopping carts. He moved carefully, his leather boots crunching on broken glass and debris. The whimpering grew louder, more urgent. "Come on, boy," he called softly. "Where are you?" The beam of light caught a flash of movement near a stack of wooden pallets leaning against the back wall of what looked like an old textile factory. Tank approached slowly, not wanting to spook the animal. As he drew closer, he could make out the dog's silhouette, hunched low, protective, its tail tucked between its legs. "Easy there," Tank murmured, crouching down about 10 feet away. "I'm not gonna hurt you." The dog looked up at him, eyes reflecting the phone's light like twin coins. It was definitely the same animal that had been terrorizing the clubhouse. A German shepherd mix probably, though it was hard to tell under all that matted fur. But what caught Tank's attention wasn't the dog itself, it was what the dog was protecting. Nestled in a makeshift shelter constructed from cardboard, plastic sheeting, and old blankets was a small figure. Tank's breath caught in his throat as he realized what he was looking at. A kid, maybe 8 or 9 years old, curled up in a sleeping bag that had seen better days. The child was awake, wide eyes staring at Tank with a mixture of fear and defiance that reminded him uncomfortably of his own childhood. "Jesus," Tank breathed. The dog positioned itself firmly between Tank and the kid, a low growl rumbling in its throat. But there was exhaustion in the animal's posture, a weariness that spoke of too many nights like this one. "It's okay," Tank said, addressing both the dog and the child. "I'm not going to call anyone. I just want to help." The kid shifted, and Tank caught a glimpse of a pale face framed by tangled dark hair. Definitely a girl, he realized, though she was doing her best to look tough. She whispered something to the dog, and the animal's growling subsided slightly. "What's your name?" Tank asked, keeping his voice gentle. The girl didn't answer immediately. She studied him with intelligent eyes that seemed far too old for her face. Finally she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Lucy." "Hi, Lucy. I'm Tank." He gestured toward the dog. "This your friend here?" "His name is Scout," she said, her hand resting on the dog's head. "He takes care of me." Tank felt something twist in his chest. He'd seen plenty of hard things in his life, violence, betrayal, the kind of cruelty that men could inflict on each other. But there was something about this small girl and her loyal protector that hit him differently. "How long have you two been out here?" he asked. Lucy shrugged, but Tank could see her shivering despite the sleeping bag. "A while. You hungry?" The girl's stomach answered before she could, producing a loud rumble that made Scout's ears perk up. Lucy's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. Tank slowly reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a protein bar he'd grabbed from the clubhouse kitchen. He tossed it gently toward the makeshift shelter. Scout sniffed it carefully before nudging it toward Lucy with his nose. "Where are your parents, Lucy?" The girl's expression hardened. "Don't have any. Not anymore." Tank nodded slowly. He'd been there himself, more or less. Different circumstances, maybe, but the same fundamental truth. Sometimes the world failed its kids, and they had to figure out how to survive on their own. "Listen," he said, "it's supposed to get cold tonight, real cold, and Scout here looks like he hasn't had a decent meal in days." Lucy's grip tightened on the dog's fur. "We're fine." "I believe you," Tank said. "You two seem pretty tough, but even tough guys need help sometimes." He stood up slowly, not making any sudden movements. "I'm going to go get some food for both of you, real food, and maybe a blanket or two. Will you still be here when I get back?" Lucy considered this for a long moment. Finally, she nodded. The morning sun cast long shadows across the clubhouse parking lot as Marcus wheeled his Harley into its usual spot. The familiar rumble of the engine died, leaving behind an oddly unsettling silence. He sat there for a moment, leather gloves gripping the handlebars, listening for something that wasn't there. No barking. For the first time in 3 months, the dog hadn't appeared at the fence line. Marcus found himself scanning the empty lot behind the chain-link barrier, searching for any sign of movement among the scattered debris and overgrown weeds. Nothing. "You look like somebody stole your lunch money." Tank's gravelly voice cut through his thoughts as the older biker approached, coffee mug in hand. "That mutt's not here," Marcus said, dismounting and removing his helmet. Tank snorted. "Good riddance. Maybe it finally found somewhere else to be a pain in the ass." But as Marcus headed toward the clubhouse, unease settled in his stomach like a stone. He'd grown accustomed to the daily ritual, the predictable appearance of the scruffy German shepherd mix who showed up like clockwork every morning. The absence felt wrong somehow, like a song missing its chorus. Inside, the clubhouse buzzed with its usual morning activity. Brothers nursed hangovers with black coffee and greasy breakfast sandwiches while planning the day's business. Normally, Marcus would have grabbed a beer and joined the conversation about upcoming runs or territorial disputes with rival clubs. Instead, he found himself drifting back toward the rear window, peering out at the empty lot. "You're obsessing over a damn dog," he muttered to himself, but couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. By noon, Marcus had made a decision that would have surprised even him a week earlier. When the others headed out for lunch, he slipped away from the group and made his way around the block to the abandoned lot. Up close, the property looked even more desolate than it had from behind the fence. Rusted shopping carts lay overturned among patches of dying grass and scattered trash. A condemned warehouse squatted at the far end, its windows boarded up and covered in graffiti. "Dog!" he called out, feeling foolish. "Here, boy!" His voice echoed off the empty building, but no answering bark came. Marcus picked his way carefully through the debris, noting fresh tire tracks in the dirt and scattered fast food wrappers that suggested recent human activity. Near an overturned dumpster, he spotted something that made him freeze. A makeshift shelter, constructed from cardboard and plastic sheeting, had been partially dismantled. Scattered around it were a few canned goods, an old blanket, and a small bowl that might have been used for water. But it was what lay beside the bowl that made Marcus's chest tighten, a child's drawing, weathered and torn, showing a stick-figure girl standing next to a large dog. The sound of approaching footsteps made him spin around. An elderly woman emerged from behind the warehouse, moving with the careful gait of someone who'd learned to be wary of strangers. Her clothes were layered and worn, and her grey hair was pulled back under a faded bandana. "You looking for somebody?" she asked, her voice carrying the rough edge of someone who'd spent too many nights sleeping rough. "The dog," Marcus said, then felt the need to explain. "It used to bark at our place every morning. Haven't seen it today." The woman's expression softened slightly. "Rex? Animal control got him yesterday. Got the girl too." "Girl?" "Maya. Sweet kid, maybe 8 years old. Been living back here with that dog for weeks." The woman gestured toward the demolished shelter. Rex was all the family she had left, far as I could tell. Protective as hell, wouldn't let anyone get near her except to bring food. Marcus felt something cold settle in his chest. "Where are they now?" "Dog's probably at the pound." "Girl?" The woman shrugged. "Social services. System's got her now." "How long were they living here?" "Since summer, maybe longer." Kid never said much, but that dog of hers was smart. Used to lead her places where she could find food, clean water. The woman's eyes grew distant. "Sometimes I'd see them in the morning and that dog would head straight for your fence line, barking his fool head off, like he was trying to tell somebody something." The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Every morning, Rex had been barking at the clubhouse, not out of territorial aggression or simple canine instincts, but as a desperate signal, a plea for help from the only nearby humans he could reach. "Which pound?" Marcus asked, his voice rougher than he intended. The woman studied him with sharp eyes. "Why? You thinking of doing something about it?" Marcus looked down at the child's drawing in his hands, then back at the spot where a little girl and her dog had made their home in the shadows of his world. For 3 months they'd been crying out for help, while he and his brothers had dismissed them as a nuisance. "Yeah," he said finally. "I think I am." The dog was waiting for him when Jake pulled into the compound the next morning. Instead of the usual frantic barking, it sat perfectly still beside the chain-link fence, watching him with those intelligent brown eyes. Jake cut the engine and studied the animal more carefully than he ever had before. It was a German Shepherd mix, probably young, but hard to tell with the matted fur and visible ribs. The dog's coat was a dirty brown and black, and there was something around its neck. Not a collar, but what looked like a piece of rope or twine. As Jake approached slowly, the dog didn't move, didn't bark, just tilted its head slightly as if asking a question. "You're not just some stray, are you?" Jake murmured, crouching down a few feet from the fence. The dog's tail gave the smallest wag. Jake had brought a breakfast sandwich from the diner, and he broke off a piece of sausage, tossing it through the chain link. The dog sniffed it carefully before eating, its movements deliberate and cautious. This wasn't an animal that trusted easily. "Jake, what the hell are you doing?" He turned to see Tommy walking toward him, leather vest creaking in the morning air. Behind Tommy, a couple other brothers were emerging from the clubhouse, coffee cups in hand, watching the scene with curious expressions. "Just thinking," Jake said, standing up slowly. The dog immediately backed away a few steps but didn't flee. "Thinking about what?" "That mutt's been nothing but trouble. Every meeting, every ride, it's out here making noise. Some of the guys are talking about calling animal control." Jake felt something twist in his chest. "Give me a few days." "For what?" "To figure this out. There's something—" He glanced back at the dog, which was now sitting again, watching them. "Something's not right about this whole situation." Tommy followed his gaze. "It's a dog, brother. Dogs bark. Especially at motorcycles, not like this, not every single day at the same time. And look at it now, calm as anything." The morning sun was climbing higher, casting long shadows across the compound. Jake noticed the dog kept looking toward the old warehouse district beyond the fence, then back at the clubhouse, as if waiting for something or someone. "You're getting soft," Tommy said, but his tone wasn't entirely unkind. "Sarah's been good for you, but don't let it cloud your judgment about strays." After Tommy went inside, Jake stayed by the fence. He pulled out his phone and did something he'd never thought he'd do, searched for local animal shelters and rescue organizations. Most of the websites were basic, showing happy adoption photos and donation requests. But one caught his attention. a small rescue operation run out of someone's home with a focus on reuniting lost pets with their families. The contact number led to a voicemail. Jake almost hung up, then found himself saying, "This is Jake Martinez. I've got a situation with a dog that's been showing up at a business location, wondering if anyone's reported a missing German Shepherd mix in the past few weeks." He left his number and hung up, feeling slightly ridiculous. The dog was still there when he looked back. On impulse, Jake walked around the perimeter of the fence, and the dog followed along on the other side, padding quietly through the weeds and debris that lined the compound's border. When Jake stopped, the dog stopped. When he changed direction, so did the dog. "What are you trying to show me?" Jake asked aloud. They reached the back corner of the property, where the fence met up with the edge of the warehouse district. Here, the dog stopped and whined softly, looking through the chain link toward a cluster of abandoned buildings. Jake had driven through that area countless times, but never paid much attention to it. Industrial wasteland, like dozens of others scattered around the city. But now he noticed things he'd missed before. Fresh tire tracks in the dirt, a few pieces of trash that looked recent rather than weather-beaten, and in one of the warehouse windows, something that might have been a curtain or tarp hanging unevenly. The dog whined again, a sound so full of longing that it made Jake's chest tighten. "Someone's over there, isn't it?" he said quietly. "Someone you're trying to get to." His phone buzzed. "Text from Sarah, how's your mysterious dog situation?" He typed back, getting more mysterious by the minute. When he looked up from his phone, the dog was sitting directly across from him, separated only by the fence and maybe 3 feet of space. This close, Jake could see that what he'd thought was rope around the dog's neck was actually a makeshift collar, woven from what looked like shoelaces. Attached to it was a small, tarnished metal tag. Jake knelt down and extended his hand toward the fence. After a long moment, the dog stepped forward and sniffed his fingers through the chain link. "We're going to figure this out," Jake promised softly. "Whatever's going on, we're going to figure it out." The sound of Tommy's bare feet slapping against the cold warehouse floor echoed through the cavernous space as he ran toward Marcus. His small frame collided with the biker's leather-clad legs, and Marcus instinctively reached down to steady the boy, feeling the tremor of fear that ran through the child's thin body. "Easy there, kid," Marcus said softly, his voice carrying none of the gruff authority he typically reserved for club business. Behind them, Diesel's growling had intensified, the dog positioning himself protectively between the group and the shadows where other figures had begun to emerge. 3 men stepped into the dim light cast by Marcus's flashlight beam. The first was lean and wiry, with the kind of nervous energy that came from too much methamphetamine and too little sleep. His companions flanked him like hungry wolves, their eyes scanning the room with the calculated awareness of predators who'd been interrupted during feeding time. "Well, well," the lead man said, his voice carrying a slight accent that Marcus couldn't quite place. "Looks like we got ourselves some uninvited guests." His gaze dropped to Tommy, and something cold and possessive flickered in his expression. Boy should know better than to run off like that. Marcus felt Tommy's grip tighten on his jeans, and he placed a protective hand on the child's shoulder. "Funny thing about that," Marcus replied, his tone deceptively casual. "See, I was just having a conversation with my young friend here about his living situation. And from what I'm hearing, there might be some misunderstandings about who exactly he belongs with." The man's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Your friend?" He took a step closer, and Marcus noticed the way his hand drifted towards something concealed beneath his jacket. "That boy's been eating our food, sleeping under our roof. Far as I'm concerned, that makes him ours until his debt's paid off." "Debt?" The word came out harder than Marcus intended, and he felt the familiar heat rising in his chest that usually preceded violence. "What kind of debt does an 8-year-old rack up?" "His daddy owed us money before he took that permanent vacation," one of the other men interjected. "Kid's got to work it off somehow. It's just business." Marcus had seen enough darkness in his 43 years to recognize true evil when it stared him in the face. These weren't just drug dealers or petty criminals, they were something far worse. The casual way they discussed Tommy's debt, the proprietary tone when referring to the child, the nervous energy that suggested they were operating on a schedule that didn't allow for lengthy negotiations. "Here's the thing about business," Marcus said, his voice dropping to the dangerous register that club members had learned to respect. "Sometimes market conditions change." Behind him, he heard the warehouse door creak open, followed by the distinctive rumble of motorcycle engines. The cavalry had arrived, though Marcus wasn't sure if that would make the situation better or worse. These men had nothing to lose, and cornered animals were always the most dangerous. "You brought friends," the lead man observed, though his confidence seemed to waver slightly as the sound of multiple bikes echoed through the space. "Smart, but not smart enough." The metallic click of a switchblade opening cut through the tension, and Marcus felt Tommy press closer against his legs. The boy was shaking now, whether from cold or fear, and Marcus realized that whatever happened in the next few minutes would likely determine whether Tommy ever felt safe again. "Diesel," Marcus said quietly, and the German shepherd immediately moved to Tommy's other side, creating a protective barrier around the child. The dog's presence seemed to give Tommy some measure of comfort, and Marcus felt a strange pride watching the bond between boy and animal manifest in such a crucial moment. Footsteps approached from behind as other club members entered the warehouse, their heavy boots creating a rhythmic counterpoint to the tension crackling in the air. Marcus didn't need to turn around to know that Reaper and probably half a dozen others were spreading out, taking tactical positions. The Hells Angels might be many things, but unprepared wasn't one of them. "Now," Marcus continued, his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his system, "we can handle this two ways. Option 1 involves you gentlemen walking away and forgetting you ever saw this boy. Option 2 involves my friends and me having a more detailed conversation about your business practices." The warehouse fell silent except for the soft whimper that escaped Tommy's lips and Diesel's low, continuous growl. Marcus could feel the weight of decisions being made in the darkness around them, calculations of risk and reward playing out in minds that had long ago abandoned conventional morality. In that moment of suspended tension, Marcus realized that everything he thought he knew about loyalty was about to be redefined by a scared child and a loyal dog who had somehow found each other in this godforsaken place. The dog's ribs showed through its matted coat like prison bars, and Marcus felt something crack open in his chest. He'd seen plenty of pain in his 43 years. In the mirror, in his brother's eyes after bad runs, in the faces of people who crossed the wrong lines. But this was different. This was innocent suffering, and it made his hands shake as he reached for his phone. "Hey, Diesel. Yeah, it's me. Listen, I need you to bring some things by the old Henderson place. Dog food, the good stuff. Water bowls. Maybe one of those blanket things." He paused, watching the dog's ears perk up at his voice. "No questions, brother. Just bring it." While he waited, Marcus sat on the warped porch steps and studied his unlikely companion. The dog had settled about 10 feet away, close enough to watch him but far enough to bolt if needed. Smart. Trust was earned, not given. Marcus understood that better than most. "You been here long?" he asked quietly. The dog's tail gave the faintest wag at the sound of his voice. "Yeah, stupid question. You can't exactly answer." But the dog could answer, in its way, the way it knew to stay hidden, the way it had learned to bark at the club every day at exactly 3:15 when the afternoon shift change brought the most people around, the way it had positioned itself where someone might eventually notice without making itself vulnerable to the wrong kind of attention. This dog was a survivor. Marcus recognized the type. Diesel's Harley announced his arrival 20 minutes later. His sergeant-at-arms climbed off his bike with a questioning look and a bag of supplies, but true to form, he kept his mouth shut. That was why Marcus trusted him. Diesel knew when to talk and when to listen. "The dog's been living here," Marcus said simply. "Needs help." Diesel took in the scene. The skeletal animal, the abandoned house, the way Marcus was sitting perfectly still like he was afraid of spooking something wild. Understanding dawned in his weathered face. "How long you think?" Diesel asked, setting down the supplies. "Based on the condition?" "Months, maybe longer." Marcus opened a can of food, the smell making the dog's nose twitch frantically. "Been coming to us every day, trying to tell us something. Dogs don't usually stick around places like this unless—" Diesel trailed off, his meaning clear. "Unless someone they loved lived here once." Marcus placed the food bowl on the porch and stepped back. The dog's hunger won over its caution, and it crept forward on trembling legs. The way it ate, desperate but careful, like someone might take it away, told its own story. "I did some checking on this place," Marcus said, watching the dog eat. "Belonged to an old man named Tommy Chen. Died about 4 months ago. No family listed. House went to the county." "And the dog?" "Nobody mentioned a dog. Probably figured it ran off or—" Marcus shrugged. They both knew the alternatives weren't pleasant. The dog finished eating and looked up at them with something that might have been gratitude. It was a medium-sized mutt, maybe part shepherd, part who knows what. Under the dirt and neglect, there might have been a beautiful animal. There still could be. "Tommy Chen," Diesel repeated. "That name sounds familiar." Marcus nodded grimly. "Should. He was the old guy who used to wave at us sometimes when we rode past. Real quiet type. Kept to himself." They stood in silence, processing the implications. Every day for 4 months, this dog had made the trek to the road to bark at their club, not random barking, purposeful, timed, desperate. It had been trying to get their attention, trying to lead them back here to a home that no longer existed, to an owner who would never return. "Jesus," Diesel breathed. "It was trying to tell us about Tommy." The dog had finished the water too, and was watching them with more alertness than it had shown before. Marcus crouched down slowly, extending his hand, palm up. The dog considered this for a long moment, then took a careful step closer. "Hey there, buddy," Marcus said softly. "I'm sorry we took so long to listen." The dog sniffed his fingers, then allowed the briefest touch on its head before stepping back. "Progress. So what now?" Diesel asked. Marcus looked at the house, then at the dog, then down the road toward their clubhouse where his brothers were, probably wondering where he'd disappeared to. His whole life was built around loyalty to the club, around keeping the family together no matter what. But looking at this forgotten animal, this living reminder of a lonely old man who died with no one to notice or care, Marcus felt the definition of family expanding in ways that made his chest tight. "Now we do what we should have done months ago," he said, standing up. "We take care of our own." The old woman's tears had dried, but her words still echoed in Jake's mind as he walked back toward the clubhouse. She used to love watching the motorcycles. The weight of that revelation sat heavy in his chest, mixing guilt with something else he couldn't quite name. Behind him, the barking had stopped entirely, the first time in months that silence had followed his departure from the fence line. The clubhouse came into view, its familiar bulk offering none of its usual comfort. Jake could hear laughter spilling from the open doors, the clink of beer bottles, and Razor's voice carrying over the rest as he regaled someone with another war story. The normalcy of it all felt strange now, like returning to a movie set after seeing behind the cameras. "There he is," Tommy called out as Jake stepped inside. "Thought maybe that mutt finally got you." Jake forced a grin, but it felt hollow, still in one piece. "Dog give up?" Razor asked from his perch at the bar, not bothering to look up from his drink. "Something like that." Jake grabbed a beer from the cooler, using the motion to avoid eye contact. The cold bottle felt good in his hands, grounding him in the present moment, even as his thoughts churned. The conversation flowed around him. Talk of upcoming runs, complaints about the heat, plans for Saturday night, but Jake found himself only half listening. Instead, he kept thinking about the photograph Mrs. Chen had shown him. Emma at maybe 7 or 8 years old, grinning gap-toothed at the camera while holding a toy motorcycle. The same smile that had looked out at him from the missing person flyers he'd seen plastered around town months ago. "You're quiet tonight," Marcus observed, settling onto the bar stool next to him. "Everything all right?" Jake took a long pull from his beer. buying himself time to think. Marcus had always been the most perceptive of the group, the one who noticed when someone's head wasn't in the game. It made him a good road captain, but right now Jake wished for a little less attention. "Just tired," he said finally. "Been a long week." Marcus nodded, but didn't look entirely convinced. "You know, my old man used to tell me something when I was wound up about stuff. Said sometimes the thing that's eating at you isn't really the thing at all. Sometimes it's what the thing represents." Before Jake could ask what he meant, the clubhouse door swung open and Detective Sarah Morrison walked in. The conversation died instantly, replaced by the kind of tense silence that always followed unwelcome law enforcement visits. Every man in the room straightened slightly, their casual postures shifting into something more guarded. "Gentlemen," Morrison said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd done this dance many times before. "Sorry to interrupt your evening." Razor turned slowly on his stool, his expression neutral but his eyes hard. "Detective, what brings you to our humble establishment?" "Just following up on some missing person cases. Wondering if any of you might have noticed anything unusual in the neighborhood lately." Her gaze swept the room, lingering for a moment on each face. When her eyes met Jake's, he felt something twist in his stomach. "Can't say we have," Razor replied smoothly. "We tend to mind our own business around here." Morrison nodded as if she'd expected that response. "I'm sure you do, but sometimes people see things without realizing their importance. A car that doesn't belong, someone walking around at odd hours, that sort of thing." The silence stretched out, thick with unspoken tension. Jake felt sweat gathering at the back of his neck, despite the evening cooling down. He thought about Mrs. Chen sitting alone in her house, about the hope and desperation he'd seen in her eyes, about Emma, whose story he still didn't fully understand, but who had somehow become real to him in a way that made his chest ache. "Well," Morrison said finally, reaching into her jacket pocket, "if anything does come to mind, here's my card." She placed it on the bar near Razor, who looked at it like it might bite him. "I'll be around the neighborhood for a while, so don't hesitate to call." She turned to leave, then paused at the door. "Oh, and gentlemen, sometimes doing the right thing is harder than doing the easy thing, but it's usually worth it in the end." With that, she was gone, leaving behind only the sound of her footsteps echoing down the street and the weight of her words hanging in the air. "Fucking cops," Tommy muttered, but there was less venom in it than usual. Razor picked up Morrison's card, studied it for a moment, then tossed it in the trash behind the bar. "Back to your drinks, boys. Nothing here concerns us." But as the conversation slowly resumed around him, Jake found himself staring at the trash can, thinking about right things and easy things, and wondering if he'd already crossed a line he couldn't uncross. The morning sun cast long shadows across the clubhouse parking lot. As Marcus pulled up on his Harley, the familiar rumble echoing off the concrete walls. But instead of the usual defiant barking that had greeted him for months, an eerie silence hung in the air. He cut the engine and listened, his heart sinking when he realized what was missing. Rex wasn't at his post by the chain-link fence. Marcus swung his leg over the bike and jogged toward the spot where the German Shepherd had maintained his daily vigil. The patch of worn earth where Rex had paced back and forth was empty, save for a few tufts of dark fur caught on the fence's lower wire. A chill ran down Marcus's spine as he noticed the small pool of dried blood near the gate. "Shit," he muttered, crouching down to examine the scene more closely. The blood wasn't fresh, maybe 8 or 10 hours old. His mind raced back to the previous evening when he'd left the clubhouse around midnight. Rex had been there then, lying down but alert, those intelligent brown eyes tracking every movement in the parking lot. Marcus stood and scanned the surrounding area, his trained eye picking up details others might miss. Tire tracks in the dirt, not from motorcycles but from a van or truck. The impressions were deep, suggesting a heavy load. His stomach churned as the implications became clear. He pulled out his phone and dialed the number Tommy had given him for Rex's owner, Sarah Chen. It rang once, twice, then went to voicemail. Her voice sounded tired even in the recording. "You've reached Sarah. Leave a message and I'll call you back." Marcus hesitated, then spoke carefully. "Sarah, this is Marcus from the motorcycle club. I think something might have happened to Rex. Call me back as soon as you get this." 20 minutes later, his phone buzzed. Sarah's voice was frantic when he answered. "What do you mean something happened to Rex? I thought he was with you guys." "With us?" Marcus frowned. "Sarah, Rex has been showing up here every day for months, but he doesn't belong to us. We thought he was just a stray who'd claimed our territory." A long pause stretched between them. When Sarah spoke again, her voice was barely a whisper. "Rex has been missing for 3 months. I've been looking everywhere for him. I had no idea he was at your clubhouse." Marcus felt like he'd been punched in the gut. 3 months? But why would he come here every day? Why would he bark at us like we were— He stopped mid-sentence as a horrible realization began to form. "Like you were what?" Sarah pressed. Marcus closed his eyes, pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to solve clicking into place. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Has anyone in your family ever had any trouble with motorcycle clubs? Any kind of conflict or bad history?" Another pause, then Sarah's voice cracked. "My brother Danny, he owed money to some bikers. Different club than yours, but they all look the same to a dog, don't they? They took him 3 months ago. Rex was there when it happened. He tried to protect Danny, but there were too many of them." Marcus's blood ran cold. "What happened to your brother?" "They found his body in the river 2 weeks later. Rex never came home after that night. The police said there was nothing they could do, no witnesses, no evidence, but Rex saw everything." The weight of understanding crushed down on Marcus's shoulders. For 3 months, Rex had been coming to their clubhouse not out of territory or stubbornness, but out of grief and rage. The dog had been mourning his owner, trying to make sense of a world where men on motorcycles had stolen the person he loved most. "I'm sorry," Marcus said quietly. "I'm so goddamn sorry, Sarah. If I'd known—" "You couldn't have known," she replied, but her voice was hollow. "And now someone's taken him again. Those tire tracks you mentioned, did you see which direction they went?" Marcus walked to the street, following the faint impressions in the dust. They headed east, toward the industrial district where abandoned warehouses provided perfect cover for activities people wanted to keep hidden. "I've got an idea where they might have gone," he said. "Sarah, I want you to stay home and wait for my call. Don't go to the police yet. If this is connected to what happened to your brother, we need to be careful about who we trust." "Why are you helping me?" she asked. "Why do you care what happens to Rex?" Marcus thought about the past few months, about how Rex's daily appearances had become part of his routine, how he'd begun to respect the dog's unwavering dedication even when he didn't understand it. He thought about loyalty, real loyalty, not the hollow version his club sometimes practiced. "Because he's family," Marcus said finally. "And family doesn't abandon family." He ended the call and headed back toward his bike, his mind already formulating a plan that would probably get him kicked out of the club, if he was lucky. The silence in the warehouse stretched like a taut wire, ready to snap. Marcus felt the weight of every eye in the room as he stood beside Tommy, the boy's small frame trembling against his leather jacket. The kid had been through hell, and now Marcus was about to drag him through another kind of storm. "You brought a kid to church?" Razor's voice cut through the air like broken glass. The vice president's scarred face twisted into something between disbelief and rage. "Have you lost your goddamn mind, Ghost?" Tommy pressed closer to Marcus, his fingers gripping the worn leather. Marcus could feel the boy's rapid heartbeat through his jacket, could sense the fear radiating from him like heat from an engine. But there was something else there too, a quiet determination that reminded Marcus of himself at that age. "This is Tommy Castellano," Marcus said, his voice steady despite the chaos brewing in his chest. "Vinny's grandson." The name hit the room like a physical blow. Marcus watched as recognition dawned on the older members' faces, saw the way Diesel's expression shifted from confusion to something approaching understanding. But it was Snake's reaction that caught Marcus off guard. The enforcer's perpetually cold demeanor cracked for just a moment, revealing something almost human underneath. "Castellano's been dead 3 years," Hammer growled from his position near the door. "Got himself killed running drugs for the Torino family." "His grandson didn't die with him," Marcus replied, placing a protective hand on Tommy's shoulder. The boy looked up at him with those dark eyes that held too much knowledge for someone his age. "Kid's been living rough since his mother overdosed. Been surviving on scraps and whatever he could find." President Cole leaned back in his chair, his weathered face unreadable. The man had led the Serpents for over 2 decades, and Marcus had never seen him caught off guard. But this was uncharted territory for all of them. "So what's this got to do with us?" Razor demanded, though his voice had lost some of its earlier venom. "We ain't running a charity, Ghost." Marcus felt Tommy tense beside him. The kid was smart enough to read the room, to understand that his fate hung in the balance of this conversation. But he hadn't run, hadn't tried to disappear back into the shadows where Marcus had found him. That took courage, the kind of courage that reminded Marcus why he'd worn this patch in the first place. "Vinny saved my life once," Marcus said, the words scraping against his throat like sandpaper. He'd never told this story, had buried it deep along with all the other pieces of his past he'd rather forget. "Back when I was running solo before I prospected here. Got caught in Torino territory with a busted bike and 3 of their guys looking to make an example out of me." The room had gone quiet again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Even Razor was listening, his hostile posture softening slightly. "Vinny could have walked away," Marcus continued, "could have let them finish what they started. Instead, he put himself between me and them. Took a beating for it too, but he got me out." Marcus looked down at Tommy, saw Vinny's stubborn streak in the set of the boy's jaw. "Told me family wasn't just about blood, but about who you choose to stand with when everything goes to shit." "Touching story," Snake interjected, his voice flat. "But the kid ain't Vinny, and debts die with the man who owes them." "Maybe," Marcus acknowledged, "but this ain't about debt." He paused, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. "It's about what kind of men we are when nobody's watching. What kind of club we want to be." Tommy shifted beside him, and for a moment Marcus thought the boy might speak. But Tommy just straightened, his shoulders, meeting the stares of the hardened bikers around him with a dignity that belonged on someone 3 times his age. Cole finally broke the silence. "What exactly are you asking for here, Ghost?" The question Marcus had been dreading, the one that would force him to put everything on the line. He thought about Max, about the dog's unwavering loyalty, about the chain of small kindnesses that had led him to this moment. Sometimes the most important decisions were the ones that made no logical sense. "I'm asking for a chance," Marcus said. "A place for him to stay, food in his belly, a shot at something better than what he's got." He met Cole's eyes. "I'll vouch for him. I'll be responsible." The president's gaze moved from Marcus to Tommy and back again. Around the room, Marcus could feel the tide of opinion shifting, could sense the internal debates playing out behind weathered faces and calculating eyes. "Kid's got Castellano blood," Diesel said quietly. "That means something in this city." The silence in Marcus's hospital room felt heavier than any roar of Harley engines Jake had ever heard. 3 days had passed since the shooting, and the old man remained unconscious, tethered to machines that beeped steadily in the antiseptic air. Jake sat in the uncomfortable plastic chair, watching the rise and fall of Marcus's chest, while Rex lay curled at his feet, a small victory that Jake had fought the nursing staff to achieve. "Still no word from his family?" Detective Morrison asked from the doorway, her voice softer than Jake had ever heard it. Jake shook his head. "Social services found a sister in Portland, but she hasn't spoken to him in 15 years. Said she didn't even know he was still alive." The words tasted bitter. Funny how blood can just disappear when you need it most. Morrison stepped into the room, her eyes moving between the unconscious man and the dog who hadn't left Jake's side since the shooting. "The lab results came back on the gun we found in Tommy's car. Ballistics confirmed it was the murder weapon from the Chen family case. We also found correspondence between him and Vincent, the Shark Castellano's crew. Jake's jaw tightened. Tommy Novak had been arrested fleeing the scene, blood still fresh on his hands from where Rex had torn into his arm during the attack. The prospect had cracked under interrogation faster than ice in summer heat, revealing a web of corruption that reached deep into the club's finances. How long had Tommy been feeding information to the Castellanos? Jake asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. Based on what we've pieced together? At least 2 years. He'd been skimming from the garage's books, selling intel about your Club S movements, even helping them identify potential witnesses to eliminate. Morrison paused. Marcus wasn't random, Jake. He saw Tommy meeting with Castellano soldiers 3 weeks ago outside that Chinese restaurant. Tommy knew the old man recognized him. The machines continued their mechanical symphony while Jake processed this information. Marcus had been protecting them all, keeping watch over the neighborhood, and it had nearly cost him his life. The irony wasn't lost on Jake. The Hells Angels member was learning about loyalty from a broken-down Vietnam vet living in a condemned building. Rex suddenly lifted his head, a low whine escaping his throat. Jake followed the dog's gaze to see Marcus's fingers twitching slightly. Then the old man's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and cloudy with medication. "Hey, old-timer," Jake said softly, leaning forward. "Welcome back." Marcus tried to speak, but could only manage a raspy whisper. Jake leaned closer to catch the words. "Rex, okay?" "He's right here, Marcus. Dog's tougher than both of us combined." Jake's voice caught slightly. "You saved my life, you know, warning me about Tommy." A weak smile crossed Marcus's weathered face. "Told you, loyalty's earned, not given." Detective Morrison stepped forward gently. "Mr. Chen, I'm Detective Morrison. When you're feeling stronger, we'll need to talk about what you saw, but for now, just focus on getting better." Marcus nodded weakly, his eyes drifting to Rex, who had stood and placed his massive head near the old man's hand. The reunion was quiet but profound, a testament to bonds that transcended species and circumstance. Over the next hour, Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness, but each time he woke, his gaze found either Rex or Jake. During one lucid moment, he managed to tell them about the night he'd seen Tommy at the restaurant, how he'd followed him afterward, and witnessed the handoff of money and documents. "I knew Tommy from when he was a kid," Marcus whispered. "Used to come around the neighborhood with his older brother. Never thought he'd turn out like this." The betrayal ran deeper than anyone had realized. Tommy hadn't just been selling information, he'd been actively participating in the Castellanos' plan to eliminate witnesses and take over the Hells Angels' territory. The garage, the clubhouse, even Jake's own apartment had been under surveillance for months. As evening approached, Morrison left to coordinate with federal agents, who were now investigating the Castellano connection. Jake remained, unwilling to leave Marcus alone again. Rex had claimed a spot on a blanket near the window, his watchful eyes moving between the door and his old friend. "Jake," Marcus said during one of his stronger moments, "that dog's been my family for 3 years now. If something happens to me—" "Nothing's going to happen," Jake interrupted. "And even if it did, Rex has got a home. Hell, he's already claimed half my bed anyway." Marcus chuckled weakly, then grew serious. "You understand now what I was trying to tell you about choosing your family?" Jake nodded, looking at the unlikely trio they'd formed, a Hells Angels enforcer, a homeless veteran, and a loyal dog. "Yeah, old man, I'm starting to get it." The silence in Tommy's hospital room felt heavier than the rumble of a dozen Harleys. Jake sat beside the small bed, watching the rise and fall of the boy's chest, each breath a reminder of how fragile everything had become. The machines beeped steadily, a mechanical heartbeat that echoed his own guilt. Sarah had finally dozed off in the chair by the window, her face etched with exhaustion and worry. The doctors said Tommy would recover, but the infection had taken its toll. 3 days of fever had left the kid looking even smaller than before, his face pale against the stark white pillows. Jake's phone buzzed. A text from Reaper, club meeting tonight. "Your presence requested." He knew what that meant. The investigation into Marcus's death had reached the club's ears, and questions were being asked. Questions about Jake's recent absences, his distraction, his divided loyalties. In the world of the Hells Angels, nothing stayed secret for long. "Jake!" Tommy's voice was barely a whisper. "Hey there, tough guy." Jake leaned forward, careful not to jostle the foreline. "How you feeling? Like I got hit by your motorcycle." Tommy managed a weak smile. "Mom said you've been here every day." "Where else would I be?" Tommy's eyes, still bright despite his illness, studied Jake's face. "You look worried, more worried than usual." The kid was too perceptive for his own good. Jake had spent the last 3 days juggling hospital visits with damage control at the club. Razor had been asking pointed questions about Jake's whereabouts the night Marcus died. Other members had noticed his distraction during rides, his absence from the usual hangouts. "Just thinking about some club stuff," Jake said. "Nothing for you to worry about." "Is it about the man who hurt Mom?" Jake's jaw tightened. He'd hoped Tommy didn't remember much from that night, but the kid had inherited Sarah's sharp mind along with her stubborn streak. "That's all handled now." "But there's something else, isn't it?" Tommy struggled to sit up straighter. "Mom gets that same look when she's trying to protect me from something." Before Jake could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Heavy boots, multiple sets. Jake's hand instinctively moved toward his waist, then remembered he'd left his gun in the bike saddlebag. Hospital security was tight about weapons. 3 figures appeared in the doorway: Razor, Snake, and Diesel. Their leather cuts looked out of place in the sterile hospital environment, but their presence commanded immediate attention. Other visitors in the hallway gave them a wide berth. "Jake!" Razor's voice carried the weight of authority. "Need to talk." Sarah stirred at the sound, her protective instincts kicking in even before she was fully awake. She positioned herself between the bikers and Tommy's bed, despite being outnumbered and outweighed. "This is a hospital," she said firmly. "Whatever business you have can wait." Razor's eyes flicked from Sarah to Tommy, then settled on Jake. "Actually, it concerns all of you." Jake stood slowly, reading the tension in his brothers' faces. This wasn't a social visit, and it wasn't going to end well. Tommy needs rest, whatever this is about. "It's about Marcus Chen," Snake interrupted. "Word is, somebody put a bullet in him 3 nights ago. Same night you went missing for 6 hours. The room temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sarah's face went white, and Jake felt Tommy's questioning gaze burning into his back. The kid was putting pieces together faster than Jake would have liked. "I don't know anything about that," Jake said carefully. Diesel stepped forward, his massive frame filling the doorway. "See, that's interesting, because Marcus's body was found with one of these nearby." He held up a small metal pin, the kind that fell off leather cuts when they got torn or damaged, the kind with the Hells Angels' death head logo. Jake's mind raced. He'd been careful that night, but Marcus had fought back harder than expected. His cut had gotten ripped in the struggle, and in the darkness and adrenaline he might have missed something. "Could belong to anyone," Jake said. "Could," Razor agreed. "But it's got blood on it, blood that don't match Marcus's type." His smile was predatory. "Amazing what forensics can tell us these days." Sarah's hand found Tommy's, squeezing tight. The boy looked confused and frightened, finally understanding that something much bigger and more dangerous than his illness was happening around him. "You got something to tell us, brother?" Razor asked, emphasizing the last word with mock sincerity. Jake looked at Tommy, the kid who'd shown him what real loyalty meant, who'd trusted him completely despite every reason not to. Then at Sarah, whose world he'd already turned upside down once. Finally at his brothers, the family he'd chosen long before he'd known what family really meant. The machines continued their steady beeping, measuring heartbeats and breaths and the precious seconds of a life hanging in the balance. The silence in the clubhouse felt heavier than the roar of a dozen Harleys. Tank sat across from Sarah in the dim light, watching her small hands tremble as she held the faded photograph of her father. The other members had cleared out, giving them space, but he could feel their presence lingering just beyond the door. "He looks like you," Tank said quietly, studying the young man in the leather jacket. Same eyes. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper. Mama said he was brave, said he stood up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. She looked up at Tank with those piercing blue eyes. She said that's why they killed him. Tank's jaw tightened. He'd heard whispers over the years, fragments of stories about Danny Morrison, but the club had buried that history deep. Danny had been before Tank's time, a member who'd supposedly gone rogue, betrayed the brotherhood. But looking at this little girl, at the pain etched in her face, Tank was beginning to understand that the official story was a lie. What exactly did your mama tell you about that night? Sarah's breathing became shallow, and she clutched the photograph closer to her chest. She said Papa found out some bad men in the club were hurting kids, taking them places they shouldn't go. When he tried to stop it, they made him disappear. The words hit Tank like a physical blow. He thought about Viper's reaction earlier, the way the older members had exchanged glances when Danny's name came up. Pieces of a puzzle he'd never known existed began clicking into place. Where's your mama now, sweetheart? Hospital. Sarah's voice broke. She's real sick. The doctors say her body is tired from being scared so long. Mrs. Chen from next door tries to help, but she can't take care of me forever. Tank felt something shift inside his chest, a protective instinct he'd never experienced before. This kid had been living in the shadows, haunted by her father's murder and watching her mother die slowly from trauma. And she'd been barking at them every day, not out of hostility, but because she was the daughter of a man they'd failed to protect. Sarah, I want you to listen to me carefully. Tank leaned forward, making sure she met his eyes. I didn't know your daddy, but if what you're telling me is true, then some people in this club did him wrong. And that means they did you and your mama wrong too. You believe me? The hope in her voice was heartbreaking. I believe you. Tank stood up, his mind already racing. But I need you to trust me now. Can you do that? She nodded slowly. Good. First thing, we're going to make sure you're safe. I'm going to talk to Mrs. Chen, see about getting you somewhere secure while I figure this out. What about the bad men? What if they find out I told you? Tank's expression hardened. Let me worry about the bad men. He pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts, finding the number for Maria Santos, a social worker who'd helped other club members navigate family situations. She owed him a favor, and more importantly, she could be trusted to keep Sarah safe while he investigated. As he made the call, Sarah wandered over to the wall where dozens of photographs hung. Club members past and present, rides and rallies, brotherhood moments frozen in time. She stopped in front of one particular photo, her finger pointing at a young man standing beside a motorcycle. That's him, she whispered when Tank finished his call. That's my papa. Tank joined her at the wall. In the photograph, Danny Morrison looked impossibly young, his arm thrown around another member Tank recognized as Viper. They were both laughing, the bond between them obvious. But what made Tank's blood run cold was the date written in faded ink at the bottom, just 3 months before Danny's supposed betrayal. Sarah, I need to ask you something important. Did your mama ever mention any names? Anyone specific who was involved in what happened to your daddy? She was quiet for a long moment, studying her father's face in the photograph. She was scared to say names, but sometimes, when she had nightmares, she would cry out. She'd say, "Please, Viper, he's just trying to protect them." The confirmation hit Tank like a sledgehammer. Viper, his mentor, the man who'd taught him what brotherhood meant, had been involved in Danny Morrison's murder. And it wasn't about betrayal or going rogue, it was about silencing a man who'd tried to expose something monstrous. Tank's phone buzzed with a text from Maria, confirming she could take Sarah tonight. But as he looked down at this brave little girl who'd been fighting a war all by herself, Tank realized his real battle was just beginning. He wasn't just investigating a cold case anymore. He was about to tear apart everything he'd believed about loyalty, family, and the brotherhood he'd sworn his life to protect. The rain hammered against the clubhouse windows as Marcus sat at the bar, staring into his whiskey glass. 3 days had passed since he'd buried Tommy in the small cemetery behind the old church, and the weight of the boy's death pressed down on him like a physical thing. The other members gave him space, understanding in their own way that something fundamental had shifted in their sergeant-at-arms. Duke padded over and rested his massive head on Marcus's knee. The dog had barely left his side since that terrible night, as if he understood the depth of the loss they both carried. Marcus scratched behind the German shepherd's ears, finding odd comfort in the animal's steady presence. "Still can't believe it," Razor said, settling onto the adjacent stool. The club president's weathered face showed genuine concern. "Kid was tougher than most grown men I've known." Marcus nodded, not trusting his voice. He'd told the club the basics, found the boy living rough, kid had cancer, didn't make it. He'd left out the details about Tommy's father, about the betrayal and abandonment that had driven a dying child to the streets. Some wounds were too raw to share, even with brothers. Funeral was good, Bones offered from across the bar. Real respectful. Think the kid would have appreciated seeing all those bikes lined up. The image brought a bitter smile to Marcus's face. Tommy would have loved the spectacle. 24 Harleys escorting his simple casket, Hell's Angels in their colors standing as honor guard for a boy who'd had no one else. The irony wasn't lost on him that the people society feared most had been the only ones to show up for Tommy's final ride. The clubhouse door swung open, bringing a gust of cold air and Detective Sarah Chen. Water dripped from her jacket as she surveyed the room, her eyes settling on Marcus. The conversations died away as the other members tensed, but Marcus waved them off. "It's okay," he said, standing. "She's here about Tommy." Chen approached cautiously, her hand nowhere near her weapon. Smart woman. She'd learned to read the temperature of dangerous rooms. "Mr. Stone, I wanted to update you on our investigation." Marcus gestured toward a quieter corner, and they moved away from the bar. Duke followed, positioning himself between Chen and Marcus with protective instinct. "We found Robert Morrison," Chen said quietly. "Tommy's father." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. "Where?" "Las Vegas. Living under his real name, working construction. He's remarried, has 2 young kids." Chen's voice carried disgust. "When we contacted him about Tommy's death, he said he had no son by that name." Marcus's hands clenched into fists. The rage that swept through him was pure and violent, the kind that had gotten him into trouble in the old days. Duke sensed it and pressed closer, a steadying influence. "He abandoned his dying boy and pretended he never existed," Chen continued. "There's no crime we can charge him with, legally speaking. But I thought you should know." "Why?" Marcus's voice came out as a growl. Chen studied his face carefully. "Because I've been watching you these past weeks. I know what that kid meant to you, and I know you're hurting. But whatever you're thinking right now, don't do it. Tommy wouldn't want that." The detective was right, and Marcus hated her for it. Every instinct screamed for retribution, for making Robert Morrison pay for his cowardice. But Tommy's voice echoed in his memory, talking about forgiveness and second chances, about being better than the anger that consumed you. "There's something else," Chen said. "The hospital social worker mentioned Tommy talked about you constantly in his final days, called you his dad." The words broke something inside Marcus. His knees buckled, and he grabbed the back of a chair for support. All the walls he'd built, all the armor he'd worn, crumbled under the weight of those simple words. "He knew he was dying," Chen said gently, "but he wasn't afraid because he knew he was loved. You gave him that gift, Marcus. You gave him a family when no one else would." Marcus felt tears he'd been holding back for days finally spill over. Around the clubhouse, his brothers pretended not to notice, giving him the dignity of his grief while staying close enough to support him if needed. Chen placed a business card on the nearby table. "If you ever want to talk, call me. What you did for that boy, it matters. It changes things." She left as quietly as she'd come, and Marcus sank into the chair, Duke immediately at his side. The dog's warm presence anchored him as the storm of emotion passed through him. Razor appeared with a fresh whiskey and sat down across from him. "Kid called you Dad, huh?" Marcus nodded, unable to speak. "Well then," Razor said quietly, "guess that makes him family. And family never really leaves us, does it?" Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing the world clean. The morning sun cast long shadows across the clubhouse parking lot as Jake knelt beside the freshly dug grave. His hands were still dirty from the previous night's work, when he and 3 other members had carefully laid Rex to rest beneath the old oak tree where the dog had spent countless hours waiting. They'd wrapped him in Jake's own leather jacket, the one with the club patches that had meant everything to him just days ago. Emma sat on the porch steps, her small frame seeming even tinier in the oversized Hell's Angels t-shirt that Diesel had given her. She hadn't spoken much since finding Rex yesterday morning, but her eyes followed Jake's every movement with a trust that made his chest tighten. The other members had been surprisingly gentle around her, their usual gruff demeanor softening whenever she was near. "You think he's really gone?" Emma's voice was barely a whisper. Jake looked up from the makeshift headstone he'd been adjusting, a piece of slate with Rex carved into it. "His body is, sweetheart. But dogs like Rex, they stick around in other ways. In the memories, in the love they taught us." Bones emerged from the clubhouse with a steaming mug of coffee, his weathered face showing none of its usual hardness. "Coffee's fresh if you want some, brother." The word brother carried weight it never had before. Over the past week, Jake had watched his club family transform. Viper had spent 2 hours the previous evening showing Emma how to change motorcycle oil, his patience infinite as she asked the same questions repeatedly. Diesel had quietly converted one of the back rooms into a proper bedroom, complete with fresh paint and furniture that had mysteriously appeared overnight. "Any word from social services?" Jake asked, accepting the coffee. Bones shook his head. "Rodriguez is still working the angles. Turns out Emma's been in the system before. Multiple foster homes, couple of failed placements. Her last family reported her as a runaway 6 months ago, but..." He glanced toward Emma, lowering his voice. "Sounds like she had good reason to run." Jake's jaw clenched. He'd suspected as much from the way Emma flinched at sudden movements, how she hoarded food like she wasn't sure when the next meal would come. Rex hadn't just been her companion, he'd been her protector, her family when the humans in her life had failed her. "We can't let them put her back in that situation." "No intention of it," Bones replied firmly. "But the legal route's going to take time. Rodriguez thinks we might have a shot at emergency custody given the circumstances." Emma stood up suddenly, brushing off her jeans. "I need to tell you something." Both men turned to her, and Jake saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before, a kind of resolve that seemed far too mature for her 11 years. "I heard you talking about custody and lawyers and stuff." She took a shaky breath. "I know you're trying to help, but I can't stay here forever. People like me, we don't get happy endings." Jake set down his coffee and walked over to her, crouching down to meet her eyes. "Emma, look at me. What do you think this is? You think we're just playing house until something better comes along? Aren't you?" Her voice cracked. "That's what always happens. People feel sorry for me, they try to help, and then they realize I'm too much trouble." "Trouble?" Bones let out a harsh laugh. "Kid, you've got more guts than half the prospects who come through here. You survived 6 months on the street with nothing but that dog and your wits. You think we don't recognize strength when we see it?" Jake reached into his pocket and pulled out something he'd been working on late into the night, a small leather patch, hand-stitched with care. It bore the club's colors, but instead of the usual Hell's Angels text, it read family in bold letters. Below it, in smaller script, Emma. "This isn't about pity," Jake said, holding out the patch. "This is about family, real family, the kind that doesn't give up when things get hard." Emma stared at the patch, her eyes filling with tears. "But I'm not a biker. I don't have a motorcycle or anything." "Neither did Rex," Jake pointed out gently. "But he had loyalty, courage, and he looked out for the people he loved." "Sounds like club material to me." From across the parking lot, Viper's voice called out, "Hey, Emma, You gonna help me with this carb rebuild or what? These Harleys don't fix themselves. Emma looked between Jake and Bones, then down at the patch in her hands. Slowly she pressed it against her chest, right over her heart. Rex would have liked this, she whispered. Rex knew this, Jake corrected, standing and placing his hand on her shoulder. Why do you think he brought you here? For the first time since Rex's death, Emma smiled, small and tentative, but genuine. Together, they walked toward the garage where their family waited. The basement beneath the abandoned auto shop held secrets that made Jake's stomach turn. 3 days had passed since he'd followed the dog's desperate barking to this hidden chamber, and the evidence he'd gathered painted a picture darker than anything he'd imagined about his own club. Photographs spread across his kitchen table told the story in brutal clarity. Tommy, the snake Castellano, hadn't just been skimming money from the club's books. He'd been running a side operation that went against every code the Angels claimed to uphold. Children, missing kids whose faces Jake recognized from milk cartons and amber alerts that had flickered across gas station TVs for months. The German Shepherd, who Jake had named Rex, lay curled by the fireplace in his cabin, finally peaceful for the first time since Jake had known him. The dog's former owner had been 8-year-old Marcus Williams, one of Tommy's victims. Rex had escaped during the chaos of the boy's abduction 6 months ago and had been trying to lead someone, anyone, back to that basement ever since. Jake's hands trembled as he reached for his phone. 40 years in the Hells Angels, through wars both literal and metaphorical, and he'd never felt more alone. The evidence implicated not just Tommy, but 3 other members he'd called brothers. Worse, it suggested club leadership had known and chosen to look the other way as long as the money kept flowing. You're gonna have to choose a side, old man, he whispered to himself, Rex's ears perking up at the sound of his voice. The phone rang twice before Detective Sarah Morrison answered. She'd been investigating the missing children cases for 8 months. Following leads that always seemed to go cold just as they got warm. Jake had watched her speak on the news, seen the frustration in her eyes that mirrored his own when the system failed the innocent. Morrison. Detective, this is Jake Rodriguez. I've got information about the missing kids. Silence stretched between them. She knew his name, knew his colors, knew the wall of silence that typically existed between law enforcement and the club. I'm listening. Not over the phone. Tomorrow night, midnight, the old bridge on Route 47. Come alone and bring everything you have on Marcus Williams. How do I know this isn't? Because I've got his dog and I know where the boy died. Jake hung up before she could respond. Rex padded over and rested his massive head on Jake's knee, brown eyes holding an intelligence that had been trying to communicate for months. The dog had been protecting the other children, Jake realized now. Every time he'd barked at the clubhouse, it was because Tommy was there, planning his next move. The next evening arrived with a cold rain that matched Jake's mood. He'd spent the day watching his brothers, seeing them through new eyes. Which ones knew, which ones would stand with him when the truth came out. The photographs and documents were sealed in a waterproof bag, along with Marcus Williams's collar that Rex had led him to in that basement chamber. Detective Morrison was already waiting when Jake arrived at the bridge, her unmarked car parked with the engine running. She stepped out as his Harley rumbled to a stop, her hand instinctively near her service weapon but not threatening. You came, Jake said, pulling off his helmet. Dead kids tend to motivate me. Her voice was hard, professional, but Jake caught the underlying pain. She'd been carrying this case like he'd been carrying the weight of his club's corruption. He handed her the bag without ceremony. Tommy Castellano, Marcus Rivera, Bull Patterson, and Jimmy Kowalski. That's your crew. The basement under Castellano's automotive on Industrial Drive. That's your crime scene. You'll find enough evidence to put them away forever. Morrison's eyes widened as she looked through the photographs. Jesus Christ, how long have you known? 3 days. Started following the dog's lead and... Jake's voice broke slightly. I've been riding with some of these guys for 20 years. Why bring this to me? Why not handle it internally? Jake looked back toward the direction of the clubhouse. where men he'd called family were probably sharing beers and stories, some of them harboring the darkest secrets imaginable. Because some things are bigger than club loyalty. That boy's dog has been trying to get justice for months, and we all just wrote it off as a nuisance. He met her eyes. Maybe it's time someone actually listened to what the innocent are trying to tell us. Morrison nodded slowly, understanding passing between them. You know what this means for you? For the club? I know what staying silent means for the next kid Tommy gets his hands on. Jake put his helmet back on. Besides, Rex here has taught me something about real loyalty. It's not about protecting the pack when they're wrong. It's about protecting those who can't protect themselves. The courthouse steps felt cold beneath Jake's boots as he waited with Marcus, watching the morning fog roll through the city streets. 3 months had passed since that night in the garage. 3 months of lawyers, social workers, and paperwork that seemed to multiply faster than he could sign it. Today would determine everything. You ready for this? Marcus asked, adjusting his tie nervously. The kid cleaned up well when he had to, though Jake could see the tattoo peeking out from his collar, a small motorcycle he'd gotten the week the adoption papers were filed. Should be asking you that question, Jake replied, but his voice carried the same tension. Behind them, the clubhouse family had gathered. Diesel, Tommy, even Sledge had shown up, looking uncomfortable in actual pants instead of his usual leather chaps. They'd all become invested in this outcome, though none would admit it outright. The social worker, Mrs. Chen, approached with a manila folder thick enough to contain a life story, which Jake supposed it did. Mr. Morrison, the judge is ready to see you both. Inside the courtroom, Jake's mind wandered to the changes these months had brought. The clubhouse had installed a basketball hoop out back after discovering Marcus's talent for the game. The kids' room, because it was his room now, not just a spare space, had gradually filled with books, music equipment, and photos. Real photos, not just the single crumpled picture of his mother he'd carried for years. Judge Hendricks was a stern woman, with grey hair pulled back severely, but her eyes held warmth as she reviewed the documents. This is an unusual situation, she began, and Jake felt his stomach drop. A minor seeking emancipation and simultaneous adoption by a non-relative with a criminal record. The words hung heavy in the air. Jake had been honest about everything. The arrests, the time served, the life he'd lived before Marcus stumbled into it. He wouldn't start this new chapter with lies. However, the judge continued, and Jake's breath caught. The evidence presented paints a compelling picture. Mr. Morrison, you've completed parenting classes, maintained steady employment, and provided stable housing. Marcus, your grades have improved dramatically, and your counselor reports significant emotional progress. Marcus shifted beside him, and Jake could see the kid's hands shaking slightly. 3 months ago, Marcus had been sleeping in abandoned buildings, eating from dumpsters, talking only to a stray dog who'd become his anchor to sanity. Now he sat in a courtroom, clean, healthy, and fighting for a family he'd never thought he deserved. What concerns me, Judge Hendricks said, is the environment. A motorcycle club isn't exactly traditional family material. Diesel stood up in the gallery. Your Honor, if I may? The judge looked surprised, but nodded. That boy saved one of our own from making the biggest mistake of his life. He showed us what real loyalty looks like. Not the kind you earn through violence or fear, but the kind you give freely because it's right. If that ain't family material, I don't know what is. Jake felt something tight in his chest loosen. These were men who'd lived hard lives, who'd made mistakes and paid prices, who'd built their own definition of brotherhood outside society's rules. But they'd opened their ranks to include a scared kid and his unlikely guardian, creating something neither traditional nor conventional, but undeniably real. Marcus, the judge addressed him directly, are you certain this is what you want? This will make Mr. Morrison legally responsible for you until you turn 18. Marcus looked at Jake, then back at the judge. He was already responsible for me, Your Honor. This just makes it official. The gavel came down with a sound that seemed to echo through Jake's bones. Adoption approved. Congratulations, Mr. Morrison. Congratulations, Marcus. Outside the courthouse, the celebration was loud and probably violated several noise ordinances as bikes roared to life. Marcus rode behind Jake on the Harley, arms tight around his guardian's, his father's, waist as they headed toward the animal shelter for the final piece of their puzzle. Rex was waiting in kennel 7, older now, greyer around the muzzle, but his tail went wild when he saw Marcus approaching. The dog had been the beginning of everything, the daily alarm that forced Jake to pay attention, to investigate, to care about something beyond his own small world. "Come on, boy," Marcus said, clipping the leash on. "Let's go home." Home. The word carried weight now, meaning more than just a place to sleep or store belongings. It meant the clubhouse where breakfast happened every Sunday, where homework got supervised by men with nicknames like Tank and Bulldog, where a makeshift family had formed around the simple idea that everyone deserved someone to bark for them when the world got too quiet. As they pulled into the driveway, Rex running alongside the bike with pure joy, Jake realized loyalty wasn't about patches or colors or brotherhood oaths. It was about showing up day after day for the people who needed you most.